look at the, okay, meeting's being recorded, and look at the production of those calls as a function of pod composition and behavior. So first, I'd like to acknowledge that Hawaii is an indigenous space. The University of Hawaii is in the land division called Waiakea in the district of Hilo. So with that, aloha and welcome everyone. So just to give you an overview of what's going to be covered in this talk, first I'm going to go over an introduction to humpback whale acoustic ecology and social grouping. And then I'm going to talk about the research approach for the study, as well as the methods and design, and report the major results. And finally, we'll discuss the significance and future directions. So first thing, we need to talk about cetaceans and sound. And by the way, cetaceans means whales, dolphins, and porpoises. Acoustic signals travel efficiently over large distances in the marine environment, especially when compared to visual signals, which can be pretty limited in the water column, and that's due to decreased visibility. Humpback whales are baleen whales, and baleen whales use sound as their primary sense for many important functions, including foraging, mating, aggression, individual identification, mating advertisement, and greeting. So basically, sound is crucial for their survival and well-being. And this graphic here shows how the acoustic environment is made up of sounds which are produced by the whales, and it also includes sources of noise produced by humans. And it also has the various instruments called hydrophones we use to study the sounds in the marine environment. So humpback whale song is produced by males and mostly heard on their breeding grounds. It consists of a nested hierarchy, as you can see in this graphic here. Song is made up of units that make up subphrases, phrases, and themes. So it's quite complex. And it's also complex in its pattern and acoustic characteristics. Songs can last hours, and the frequency range is from approximately 100 hertz to 4 kilohertz. Song is dynamic, changes within a season, and it changes between seasons, indicating cultural transmission for passing song information. Some of the possible functions of song are likely for displays for mating or synchronizing estrus among females, male cooperation, and possibly sonar. And a fun fact is that song, when it was discovered in 1971 by Payne and McVeigh, it actually helped inspire the international Save the Whales movement in the 1970s, which helped lead to the global environmental movement. So it's had a profound impact on human society as well. So in this slide, I have a little clip of song just to give you an idea of kind of what it looks and sounds like. And this is in an acoustic software program called Raven Pro. Oops. And that brings us to non-song calls, which is the topic of today's presentation. These sounds, have a shorter duration. They don't have like a pattern as in that last clip, and there are a lot of empty spaces between them. So unlike song, non-song calls, which are also referred to as social sounds, are produced by both males and females, rather than just males, and it can be found across migratory, feeding, and breeding grounds. Non-song calls lack the rhythmic or pattern quality that we see in song, and they are historically understudied because song is really cool, but today we're going to talk about why non-song calls are really cool too. In recent years, these studies have been gaining traction. We have studies and vocal repertoires described for feeding grounds, migratory routes, and breeding grounds. And non-song calls also include percussive sounds, such as tail or fin slapping at the surface, underwater blows, and breaching. So why is it important to study non-song calls? Developing a vocal repertoire for a population can help with multiple things, including understanding the impact of human-made noise on communication, which is caused by oil drilling, shipping, cruises, recreational vessel traffic, and military exercises. It can also help with the long-term acoustic monitoring of these populations. And that can kind of go in place of the traditional ship-based surveys that scientists do that are very costly and often logistically challenging in environments with rough seas or extreme temperatures. It also allows for comparing call types between different populations and can point to evolutionary or ecological roles in acoustic communication or the influence of geographical location. And now I'm going to talk to you a bit about the previous studies that have been done for this population off of Hawaii. Previous studies have found that call rate is increased with larger pods and pods that are engaged in surface activity and aggressive behaviors. And that was done by a foundational study by Silber in 1986. And 2 playback studies, which play recordings of non-song calls and songs, showed that mother-calf pairs either showed avoidance or no response to hearing these recordings. And a study on humpback whale calves in the Hawaiian breeding ground showed that those calls produced by calves were short in duration, low frequency, pulsed, and they were either frequency or amplitude modulated. And this brings us to the fact that no previous studies have described a call repertoire across different pod types and age classes in this population. So this is a very important region for this population's health and survival. Each winter, roughly 8,000 to 10,000 humpback whales of all age classes and stages of sexual maturity gather off of Hawaii. So you can see in this infographic here, many of the whales that come here for their winter breeding area do go to Alaska for their feeding ground. And that's something to keep in mind as I continue in this presentation. So this study utilized a 10-year archival database from 1998 through 2007 of underwater video and acoustic recordings. So with that database, I established the call repertoire for this population. And I did that through the acoustic analysis of those calls. And then I also statistically classified a subset of calls into groups using a hierarchical agglomerative cluster analysis. Next, I looked at call rate, which is calls per minute, and the call groups that were defined by that cluster analysis. And finally, I examined how call rate was influenced by pod composition, as well as pod type. And then I also examined how call groups related to pod type and behavioral state. So the research questions for the study, well, first we'll talk about the goal. The goal of the study was to establish the non-song repertoire of the Hawaiian breeding population and to examine how pod type, pod composition, and behavior factor in terms of call rate and the call groups. So now for the research questions. First, I wanted to know, are certain pod types more likely to produce non-song calls than others? And does call rate, and as I defined earlier, calls per minute, do they vary according to pod type and pod composition? And then does call rate vary according to pod size? And then for the fourth question, does call rate differ in pods with a calf versus pods that do not have a calf? And finally, does behavior and pod type impact the type of call produced? So these are the various pod types or social grouping on the breeding ground. Understanding the nature of humpback whale pod composition on breeding grounds will help us understand their sound production. And I'm going to go into detail about each pod type in the next slides. So I have a video here to kind of give you an idea of what the video data looks like. This one doesn't have sound. So this is called a dyad, which is a pair of whales, and it's usually 2 males or a male and female. It's rare to see 2 females on a breeding ground. Dyads spend a large portion of their time stationary in deeper water. And this will give you an idea of typical behavior. And next we have mother-calf pods. Humpback whale calves are highly dependent upon their mothers for nourishment and protection and are often seen closely following the mother. They typically remain within 50 meters of their mother. And that brings us to mother-calf escort pods. So these mother-calf pairs can be accompanied by a single male escort. Escorts may be engaging in mate guarding, trying to prevent other males from mating with a female that they may have recently mated with. I like to think of these escorts as temporary boyfriends for a few hours or a few days. And there you can see the escort. And now to competitive pods. Competitive pods contain multiple males which are competing for a single female, which is referred to as a nuclear animal of the pod. And they're often displaying highly energetic and aggressive behaviors. Pod size can vary from 3 animals to over 25 animals. And this video clip has an example of some of the social sounds you can hear, or the non-song calls. Okay, so now for methods. Data was opportunistically collected from 1998 through 2007 between December and May, which is the breeding season for humpback whales off of the Maui area. This area contains one of the highest concentrations of humpback whales in the Hawaiian Islands. And this image right here is actually Adam holding the camera setup, which I'll talk about. So video and acoustic recordings were collected by an in-water observer operating a digital video camera in underwater housing, which was equipped with a single uncalibrated hydrophone. The hydrophone had a sensitivity up to about 20 kilohertz. All recordings were accompanied by detailed surface and in-water logs provided by the scientists on the vessel at the surface, as well as the in-water observer that had detailed information about the pod and behavior. So for data processing, those many DV tapes in that digital camera were digitized using Adobe Premiere Pro to extract the video and audio recordings. All files were visually and orally reviewed for their entirety. And all calls were extracted manually using Raven Pro software. And a subset of those calls were used for the cluster analysis. To qualify for the cluster analysis, calls had to meet the signal to noise ratio, or the SNR, of at least 10 decibels and had to not be obstructed by background noise. Background noise included song chorusing happening throughout the water column, vessel noise, flow and drag noise, or breathing noises from the in-water observer. And sometimes there were multiple calls occurring simultaneously, and so those calls weren't able to be used for the cluster analysis. So these acoustic parameters were used to group calls together in the cluster analysis. And you can see that in this table here. And a lot of them are related to frequency. So a spectrogram is a visual representation of sound, and here I have an example of a call pulled up in Raven Pro software to kind of show you some of those parameters in the previous table. So you have time and kilohertz on the X and Y axes, and these fainter lines here are called harmonics, which are usually not as important for acoustic measurements. So when I'm looking at a call in the program, I'll select the fundamental frequency, which you can see here with this yellow bar. And then these arrows signify the start frequency and the end frequency. So for the behavioral analysis, calls are located by their timestamp within the video recordings, and the behavior occurring at that time of the call production was recorded using this ethogram. So in this ethogram, you can see that I have 3 behavioral states, which are traveling, stationary, and active. Behavioral states were logged at the pod level rather than detailed behaviors of individual whales. And the reason I did that is because it's not possible to determine which individual whale is producing calls within a pod. So we just kept it at the pod level. So traveling involves behaviors such as continuous swimming in a direction at a greater speed than resting. Stationary is when the pod was maintaining position with little or slow movements. And the active behavioral state included high energy behaviors occurring at depth or at the surface, such as lunges, strikes, rolling, or aerial displays such as breaching or slapping of the fins or head or tail at the surface. So this table, and the fun part, the results, this table kind of shows the breadth of the data. As you can see, each year has the number of pods by pod type, which are designated by color. And you'll notice some years were more sparse than others due to limited time in the field, which was related to various factors. So for the data set, a total of approximately 52 hours were viewed in their entirety. And that resulted in 7,795 total calls extracted. And this pie chart here has a proportion of pods with non-song calls. So I was actually kind of surprised to find that of the whole data set, 14% of the pods that were recorded actually had non-song calls detected. I was expecting more of them. So we're going to break that down a little bit by pod type. So here, this shows that the total pods recorded in the data set were 1,533. And of those, 211 pods contain the non-song calls. So as I mentioned, 14%. And you can see that the large majority of those pods are competitive pods, which are followed by the dyad pairs and mother calf of the escort. Other pods, which are at 7% of the pods with non-song calls, included pods that were all male or mother yearling pairs. And singletons, or just single whales, and mother calf pods made up a pretty small proportion. So here we're going to talk about pod size and call rate. And we see the average call rate by the number of whales in a pod. I saw an increase in call rates as more whales were present. I validated these results using a Kruskal-Wallis test and found the results to be statistically significant. Looking more closely at the variables with the Wilcox pairwise test, I found a statistically significant difference between the call rate of the pods with 4 or more whales when compared to these other categories, but not between the 1, 2, and 3 whale pods. And so for pod type and call rate, I also validated that with the Kruskal-Wallis test and found the results to be statistically significant. Again, the competitive pods, which encompass most of the larger pods, stood out as statistically significant when compared against the call rate of other pod types. And so for calf presence and call rate, calf presence was found to have a statistically significant impact on call rate, with calf presence decreasing the average call rate. For the cluster analysis, of the 7,795 total calls detected in the data set, 1,560 of those calls, or 20% of that call set, met the criteria for the cluster analysis. Calls were classified into 5 call groups from the hierarchical agglomerative cluster analysis. You can see each group is designated by a color block. Acoustic parameters for all the calls were highly variable, with a mean peak frequency of 1,885 hertz, ranging from about 46 hertz to 9,700 hertz. And the average duration was about 0.28 seconds. And the duration ranged from about 0.025 seconds at the smallest to, a little over 3 seconds. So we're going to talk about the first group, which is the low frequency harmonic calls. This was the most common call group. Calls were both the lowest and average frequency, including peak, center, and low frequency, and the second longest and average duration per call. Calls in this grouping were almost entirely harmonic, and many of them displayed an upsweep at the latter end of the call. So here I have the spectrograms of each call and the name. And if there's a little star asterisk by the name, that's because that call was detected in another population from another study. And now I'm going to play you a little sound clip. A lot of these are faint or short, so hopefully you can hear them. So that's a whoop. And next we have a modulated moan, a descending moan, a yap, and a yelp. And finally, we have the cry call. And then the next group is the low frequency pulsed and grunt calls. These calls consisted of low grunt sounds, as well as some higher short chirping sounds, and longer calls among this group displayed pulsive qualities. Calls here had a higher average peak frequency than the first group, and lower frequency harmonic calls. I'm sorry, the first group is the low frequency harmonic calls. This group had calls with a higher average peak frequency than the past group. These are the shortest duration calls. And so I'm going to play a grunt for you. That's really short. Hopefully you could hear it. And then a purr. And this call I didn't see described in any other studies, but it's important to keep in mind that not every population of humpback whales has studies describing the non-song calls, and they're not exhaustive. But this sounded to me like a low frequency grind, which is why I just named it that. And next we have the mid to high frequency harmonic call group. These calls had a higher fundamental frequency compared to the last group, which was the low frequency pulsed grunt calls. And these calls are mostly harmonic. The calls often display dynamicism with the pitch moving up and down throughout the duration of the call. And first we're going to start with the ascending moan, variable screech, which is another one I haven't seen described in other studies, and the ascending screech. And next we have the high frequency tonal calls. This call group had the highest frequencies, fewest harmonics, and higher fundamental frequency than the high frequency harmonic calls. And so I'm going to play you the descending shriek. So it's short, but you can kind of hear it go down and you can see that. And then we have the ascending shriek and the squeak. And the final group is the noisy complex call group. This is the least common call group, as you can see how it lines up with this color box. It's the longest average duration for these calls and had the widest ranges between their high and low frequencies and the start and end frequencies. So this is a long screech. And I named this call washboard because that's what it sounds like to me. And then we have the squeegee call, which sounds exactly like a squeegee. And this final call, I named washboard cry, and other studies we've seen that sometimes these non-song calls can kind of come out as what we call combined calls. This kind of has two components. So for behavior and call group, the active behavior had every call group and the most variety of calls, while the stationary behavior skewed towards low frequency harmonic and low frequency pulsed and grunt calls, with no noisy and complex calls. This table shows the number of calls within each call group by pod type. So you can see singletons had only mid to high frequency harmonic and high frequency tonal calls. Mother calf pods were almost entirely low frequency pulsed and grunt calls. And mother calf escort pods had mostly mid to high frequency harmonic calls. Interestingly, dyad pairs tended towards higher frequency and comprised the majority of noisy complex calls. and competitive pods had calls distributed across all call groups, and other pods were almost exclusively low frequency harmonics. So now we're going to get into the discussion and revisit our goals and the research questions. So again, the goal is to establish a non-song repertoire of the Hawaiian breeding population and to examine if pod type, composition, and behavior affected call rate and call groups, which I was able to describe more throughout the study. So to get to the research questions, are certain pod types more likely to produce non-song calls than other pod types? At least the result in this study, we can say yes. Competitive pods made up the largest portion of pods that had call detections, and mother calf pods made up a small portion of pods with non-song call detection. So I want to bring up a concept called vocal crypsis, which was detailed by Thesis et al. In 2017. And that study reported that mother calf pods display a form of vocal crypsis, meaning they make lower energy calls to possibly avoid nearby males seeking mating opportunities, to save energy and avoid possible injury. This could explain why mother calf pods rarely had calls detected in recordings. So for the second question, does call rate vary according to pod type and pod composition? Competitive pods had the highest call rates, but they had a high standard deviation showing variability within this category. And for the third question, does call rate vary according to pod size? Pods with higher number of whales had higher average call rates, which was also seen in that foundational 1986 study by Silber. And a higher number of escorts could be from increased aggression, which is known to play a role in call rate. So for the fourth question, does call rate differ in pods with a calf versus pods without a calf? Call rate decreased if a calf was present, and this is perhaps due to the greater reproductive potential of females without a calf, if calls are indeed used in competition or for courting. And then for the final question, does behavior and pod type affect the call group type? Active behaviors had all call groups present and show the greatest diversity of call types. Stationary behaviors displayed mostly low-frequency grunt calls and no noisy and complex calls. And mother calf pods exclusively were found with low-frequency grunts and pulse calls, which is similarly reported in that Thesis et al. 2008 study on humpback whale calves off of Hawaii. For low-frequency calls are common in baleen whales, likely for long-distance communication given their annual migrations of up to 10,000 miles. Perhaps high-frequency calls serve as a short-range communication function among pod members within a group. Singletons exclusively produced high-frequency calls, which are linked with arousal in other species. And the frequency averages were generally higher in this population compared to those described in other studies. So this table shows all the call types you've now heard and seen on the previous slides found in this population, and it shows which of these calls are shared with other populations of humpback whales. So as you can see, the whoop call here is present in every population, which shows that it's probably pretty significant for this species. Interestingly, the squeegee call has only been documented off the feeding ground in Southeast Alaska, and now the same populations. Sorry, you can mute yourself. Okay, cool. So just to go back, so the squeegee call was documented off the feeding ground in Southeast Alaska, and now the same population's breeding ground here off Hawaii. So it's possible this call type could be unique to this North Pacific population of humpback whales. And 6 other call types were shared with this Alaskan population based off of those previous studies done by Michelle Fournier. The grunt call was found in populations in other ocean basins, and perhaps it could be a species-wide call that serves multiple uses in different behavioral contexts. And for the broader implications, anthropogenic noise from tourism and whale watching industry is increasing in this critical habitat off of Hawaii. And noise pollution could result in acoustic masking, which has been proven to negatively impact and impede communication in cetaceans. Due to the low amplitude of humpback whale calls, these calls could be at greater risk for being drowned out by noise pollution. Calls detected in multiple populations could also be ideal candidates for passive acoustic monitoring to aid in conservation and management efforts of these populations. So for future directions, low frequency calls occupy the same frequency band as a lot of background noise from nearby vessels. And also surface noises, flow and drag, and breathing from the in-water observer. So these calls were less likely to meet the requirements for the statistical cluster analysis. So it'd be great if future studies that are able to detect and detail lower frequency calls could happen, and I think that would be very helpful. Description of call repertoires of other breeding ground populations, such as those off Tonga or the Caribbean, could be very helpful in cross-breeding population comparisons with this one. An additional one would be using hydrophone arrays that can kind of help triangulate and determine which individual is producing a call. That would allow for a detailed behavioral analysis to provide a richer understanding of the relationship between behavior and call production. It would also be great to include a discovery curve to determine the stability of the call types in the repertoire, and if new calls are produced or if the call repertoire is closed. And lastly, future studies that compare calls with song units from that year to determine if there's a relationship between the song units and non-song calls could help reveal some information about the development of non-song calls on the breeding ground. And so for the final conclusions, the majority of pods in this population were not found to produce non-song calls. 86% of them did not have calls in the study period. Unique calls were found here, but also shared calls with other populations across the globe and in different behavioral contexts. Social grouping showed some kind of impact on the rate of call production, and competitive pods and pods that were larger and without calves produced the most calls. Behavior impacts what types of calls are produced, and active behaviors are the most commonly associated with call production. Also, the commonality of these call types suggests that calls may serve as a stable part of the humpback whale acoustic communication system. And most importantly, if there's one thing you take away from this presentation and the study, is that humpback whale calls are just as cool and interesting as song. And I'd like to acknowledge my advisor, Adam Pack, and committee members, Dr. Allison Stipper and Patrick Hart, for their guidance and mentorship throughout this process. I'd like to acknowledge funding for this project was provided by the CREST NSF Fellowship, and data were collected with the appropriate permits and collected via a team of scientists and volunteers over the years through the Dolphin Institute, the Kewalo Basin Marine Mammal Laboratory, the University of Hawaii, and the Earthwatch program. And finally, I'd like to thank my partner, sister, and friends for supporting me through this process, and to my lab assistants, Jasmine Romero-Helzer, Caitlin Cush, and Sophia Smith for all their help. And that's it. Thank you.